Hello. Hello. Siapa tu? I cannot hear you. Ada tutup pintu ni.
Ya, Dato'.
Ayo. Siapa ni? Azira Najwa.
Ya, saya Dato'.
Dari mana ni Azira?
I'm from Pahang.
Tak. You dari.
I'm from MIT.
Okay. Siapa organizer ni?
It's from WCSC. Kami ada 3, iaitu from PAM, there's from...
Rif. Ini atas dia.
Datuk Sri.
Ya, tak apa jelas lah.
You're playing on the live stream, you know. Can you take it off first?
I think saya
To me. Atas meja. Back to me. Kecil ya, back. Yeah, hello. I cannot hear anyone.
Yes, Dato'. We are on live right now.
Ah.
And we're going to start in 1 minute.
Okay.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second session of the 12th World Class Sustainable Cities International Conference. I hope all of you have a sumptuous and wonderful lunch, and we'll be right away for the afternoon session, which will have lots of interesting presentations. The first keynote presentation this afternoon will feature a phenomenally successful and experienced speaker, the Secretary General of Ministry of Environment and Water, or also known as CASA, Yang Berbahagia Datuk Seri Engineer Dr. Zaini Ijam. The presentation entitled National Low Carbon City Master Plan. Yang Berbahagia Datuk Seri Engineer Dr. Zaini Ijam was appointed as the Secretary General of Ministry of Environment and Water, Malaysia in short CASA, since March 2020. Prior to that, he has served as Secretary General to various ministries in Malaysia. Among them are Ministry of Energy, Green Technology and Water from August 2016 to July 2018. Ministry of Higher Education from July 2015 until July 2016. Ministry of Education from June 2013 until July 2015. In 2008 until 2015, at the age of 43, he was appointed as the Vice Chancellor of University Technology Malaysia, and prior to that, Datuk Seri was the professor at UTM from 2002. He has published 45 books, more than 200 scientific papers, and more than 2,000 general articles. His Bachelor of Chemical Engineering from UTM and Master at PhD in Environmental Engineering Newcastle, UK. He also registered with various professional bodies and recognized as PhD, Professional Engineering, Chartered Engineer UK, Chartered Scientist UK, Asian Chartered Professional Engineer, and many more. He is an expert in environmental sustainability, energy security, green technology, business sustainability, public engagement and participation, and transformation process. He has extensive networking with various foreign universities like Harvard, MIT, Columbia, Imperial College London, Oxford, Tokyo, Kyoto, London, and so many professional organizations. Please welcome Yang Berbahagia Datuk Seri Engineer Dr. Zainul Ijam to deliver the presentation. Datuk, you are mute.
Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver my thought on low carbon cities, especially policy related to Malaysia. Okay. So I'm going to talk today mainly on the transition that makes Malaysia and many cities in Malaysia low carbon cities. As mentioned by Prime Minister just now, during the 12 Malaysian Plan speech, 120 cities will be considered as low carbon cities by 2030 in Malaysia. And it is also important to recap the speech by Prime Minister just now, that Malaysia remains committed to its target of becoming a carbon neutral nation by as early as 2050. So mark his word, as early as 2050. Not many countries have registered their interests to become carbon neutral by 2050. Some of them mentioned it many times, but as far as deliberation and submission to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a compulsory for us to show that. So this is our position for the coming Conference of Parties 26 in Glasgow in November 1st to November 14 this year. And in relation to that, the Prime Minister has reaffirmed that the government will take into account environmental, social, and governance ESG principles in its decision-making process. So let's start. Today we are talking about low carbon cities. But Prime Minister's mentioned about carbon neutral goal. So this is two different concepts before we start. So what I'm going to talk about roughly on related issues that we know very well. The impact of climate change and what is the policy direction in Malaysia. What are the drivers on low carbon cities initiative and the rest. So this is an example. If we travel in a city, you can have a straight path if you cycle or if you walk. And a bit curvy if you take, say, for example, buses or tram. But if you drive yourself, this is the zigzag thing that's going to happen. Therefore, I like this illustration by cartoonist Lat on me to indicate my interest on cycling. So if I were to do things big for the country, if I were to be able to be a master builder or thinker how to make cycling as part of Malaysian culture will be very interesting. It's not part of recreational or sports. Malaysia is damn good in sport. We won bronze or silver in Olympics for that. And Bursa has announced on 22nd of September this year that they would like to become, they are aspired to become carbon neutral by 2022 and achieve a net zero emission by 2050. So you can see there's a lot of terminologies people are using, low carbon, carbon neutral, net zero emissions. They want not make people confused. And some people, they announce or they use it without understanding what are the meanings of all this. So let's first work on the major contributor to the carbon emissions or greenhouse gases in many places in the world. So we take one of them, passenger transport, say for example. You can see that for 88 passengers of airplanes, you contribute up to 285 grams of CO2 per passenger kilometer. Yeah, so you just add or multiply number of kilometers. The lowest is tram or LRT, MRT, which is about 14. If you have 166 people in the coaches. Cars still highest, but motorcycles, so which is very obvious in places like Indonesia, Malaysia, and many parts of the world, they are bigger contributor to climate change or to CO2 emissions compared to, say, for example, SUV or we can see that, yeah. So time are ticking. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, Malaysia is committed to reduce GHG, greenhouse gases, emission by carbon intensity by 45% by 2030. So there are three major things there. One is GHG, greenhouse gases. Carbon intensity is the way we monitor and we reduce them, manage them. There are three ways to do it. One is carbon intensity. We can use also business as usual, per business as usual. And then we can also use by tonnage of CO2 or CO2 equivalent reduction. The announcement of Prime Minister just now was for 2050. As far as 2030, we are still with 45%, yeah. So these are the GHG emission in Malaysia. You can refer to BUR3 Malaysia. Just write down in your Google, you'll find all the status, about 285 pages of documents. And the upper point, or the axis, the positive upper axis, you can see the emission component. We have energy, which is about 80%. Waste materials, about 8%. Land use and land use change emission. So in case a developer would like to develop a new housing estate or new township, so we have to cut trees and whatnot. So that is a LULUF emission. And when we do that, the green dark color will be increasing, and the green, light green, will be decreasing. So it means that our emissions increase and our offsetting capability is decreasing. So offsetting capability is the LULUF CF removals. And we have also agriculture, big in many countries, but not as big in Malaysia. and industrial processes. There are two options. We can exceeding the carbon emission or the greenhouse gases emission, or we decrease it, or we can increase the land use and land use change and forestry, or reduce it. Yeah, so that there are options for us. So if I were to look at it, Malaysia is non-Annex 1 countries in category. So it means that Malaysia are considered as developing nations as far as Paris Agreement we signed in 2016 instead of 2015. You can see from a planning perspective, from say for example, property development perspective, what concerns us is land use and land use change and forestry emission. You can see that in 2014, it was only 3.32 million tons CO2 equivalent. It changed to 17.80. So the data in 2016 is the latest, because as non-Annex 1 country, we are reporting -4. So it was in 2020, we were reporting for 2016. So next year, 2022, we are doing the same for 2018. The most glaring is emission. Therefore, when I was invited to talk, to deliver a keynote here, my message is very simple. In order to make sure that we are able to comply with ESG, environment, social and governance in this sector, our main priority is that LULUCF emission. So please think very carefully and find ways and means how, while developing an area, we are not enhancing or producing gas emissions, carbon, GHG emission. Yeah. So per capita in Malaysia, without LULUCF emission, without LULUCF removals, we are producing 10.016 tons CO2 equivalent per capita. So that's our tonnage in terms of carbon. So we are very loaded carbon. We are almost similar to countries like Indonesia, Japan, Singapore, and others. Yeah, and countries like Indonesia, they are less than 3. So this was our first amendment to our previous nationally determined contribution. So the question is, what is NDC, nationally determined contribution? It is the statement by a country how to reduce carbon to the Paris Agreement, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we have done it, and this is the first time we make alteration. So what alteration we make? We mentioned that we are going to keep at 45%, and it is unconditional this time. Previous one, it is conditions only 35% ours and 10% on condition of assistance from developed nations. So as far as we are concerned, there are very little possibilities for developed nation to assist us in that sense. So we just going our own, and then without denying the possibility for us to get that. Yeah, so not necessarily we say no to you to develop the assistance from developed nation, but we just say that if you give, we take, otherwise we can do it ourselves. The target increased by 10%, from 35% became 45%. And the GHG coverage expanded from 3, carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide, to 7. So many people say that carbon intensity is misnomer, because we are not only referring to carbon. There are, okay, those who are not familiar with chemistry, when you say carbon, you must have C, carbon, carbon dioxide, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons. So this is all with C. Yeah, but for sulfur hexafluoride is without C. Nitrogen trifluoride without C. Yeah, so overall we call them greenhouse gases. So terminology of greenhouse gases is better to indicate our commitment. But since people coming to on board, they didn't probably very familiar with that. They just say, we want to reduce carbon. If you just want to reduce carbon, you just reduce CO2 or methane and hydrofluorocarbon. So let's see what is net zero is all about. The concept of balancing anthropogenic GHG emissions and removal. Anthropogenic means caused by human being, caused by human activities. At country level, the basic definition of net zero emissions, excluding international transfers of GHG mitigations, is GHG emission released to the atmosphere from sources within the country's territory in the target year do not exceed GHG removed from the atmosphere by sinks within the country's territory in the target year. So what is also important here is not only emission, but also target year. So that's very important. In some countries, however, they include international transfers of GHG mitigation in definition of the net zero emission. It means that, say, for example, a company from Malaysia, they also buy carbon emission from carbon offsetting from other countries, assuming our neighboring countries. So in that case, in our situation, we didn't calculate that. Yeah, within a given time period, a country might have net zero emission, net positive emission, or net negative emissions. There are many terminologies I'm going to talk about. So please refer to this one. Decarbonization not necessarily implying zero emission. Yeah, so that's very important. And decarbonization is primarily on energy production. So we use this, say, for example, for energy sector, production of electricity, then you use decarbonization words. But overall, we call net zero carbon emission. So that equivalent to carbon neutrality. Remember when Prime Minister mentioned about Malaysia would like to have neutral carbon? So it means that net zero carbon emissions. It's a net zero target refers to reaching net zero carbon emission by a selected date. So we have indicated that the earliest by 2050, yeah? There are also better terminology, net zero GHG emission. This is perfect definition, but it's very mouthful. It's very difficult to explain. So most people, including our Prime Minister just now, use the words carbon neutrality. This means annual zero net anthropogenic human cost or influence CO2 emission by a certain date. By definition, carbon neutrality means every ton of anthropogenic CO2 emitted is compensated with an equivalent of CO2 removed via carbon sequestration, but this term has been used differently on occasion. Instead of aiming at zero net emissions, some countries seem to misinterpret carbon neutrality as stabilizing emission at a certain level. So that's a lot of things. I don't want to talk about it because we are talking about low carbon. Yeah, so I just want to make sure that everyone understand actually low carbon is slightly misnomer. It's supposed to be low GHG. Yeah, but since it is acceptable to use low carbon emission, low carbon cities and whatnot, so we still keep on it. Carbon neutrality refers to the idea of achieving net zero GHG emission by balancing those emissions so they are equal or less than emission that get removed through the planet's natural absorption sink. In basic terms, it means we reduce our emission through climate action. So there must be action to do it. There must be initiative to reduce carbon emission. Yeah. So this is something interesting for us to ponder upon. The data that I mentioned earlier, if we have net positive is above zero. So say, for example, in our data, we had A, which is 316, and our net negative, which is our offsetting value, is minus 241.3. So we have net positive, means that A plus B, we still have 75.4. So when we say we have net zero, it means that it will locate at zero. Yeah, it means that A plus B equal to zero. The ideal is to have net negative, or in this term, we call it carbon negative or climate positive. So you see, carbon negative, also called climate positive. It's very good for climate. It means that our net negative is higher. It means that our emission is less than our absorption capability by land use and land use change and forestry removals. So that is a situation. We actually had carbon neutral many times. Yeah, in 2000, 2004. In fact, we have carbon negative. I mean, our net negative prior to that. Yeah. This is what we have done. As far as ministry is concerned, we have established Malaysia Climate Change Council, chaired by Prime Minister, attended by all Menteri Besar and chief ministers and respective relevant ministries. Completion of Malaysia updated NDC to UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that was done in July. The slide that I've shown. We have done our low carbon cities blueprint and low carbon mobility. So I'm going to talk about low carbon cities later. What we are doing now, starting from I think a few weeks ago, we started a carbon market mechanism with Bursa, establishment of greenhouse gas inventory center, which is very difficult actually because we need a lot of facilities. We have started climate change policy. We have appointed, and then development of climate change legal framework. This is what makes us quite hectic these few days. So the basic principles now became carbon in terms of currency of discussion. Though I mentioned it might be slightly misnomer, but this is what people are doing. Yeah. And reduce carbon emission to net zero or increase carbon sink. Methodology is use green technology, or we can use green cover, land use change, and forestry removal. Yeah? So this is very important. And what is also important is what kind of system we want to develop. One is low carbon lifestyle and circular economy. So we have a kind of climate culture that very concerned about what's going to the effect to the culture. And we require a lot of assistance from climate financing. Therefore, we work with Bursa to expedite the process. This is you can see a lot of these are available on the net. You can just Google BOR, Biennial Update Report Malaysia, NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution. And this is what we are going to do next year, long-term low emission development strategy. For industry, for companies, for corporations, they don't have NDC, they have ESG. So that equals to NDC to a company. So as mentioned by Prime Minister in his speech just now. So why cities important? Because 80% of world population are living in cities. Yeah. They are responsible, or I'm so sorry, consume over 2/3 of global energy supplies. 80% of the world's GDP are in cities, responsible for 70% of GHG. And by 2050, more than 2/3 of the people will be urban dwellers. This is based on a study. So towards sustainable development, we are relying so much on green technology. Prime Minister mentioned just now that we are going to retire our coal power plant when it expired their contracts. I think by 2045, completely there will be no coal power plant in the country. Yeah. And in order to do that, we have to improve our energy sector, energy independence, and promote efficient utilization. On environment, we conserve and minimize the impact on the environment, enhance national economic development through the use of technology, and improve the quality of life for all. So this is include to include urban dwellers. So according to United Nations Habitat, world cities are responsible, as I mentioned earlier, but what is important, the solution cities are responsible for the majority of our harmful greenhouse gases, but they are also places where the greatest efficiency can be made. This makes it imperative that we understand the form and content of urbanization so that we can reduce our footprint. Understanding the contribution of cities to climate change will help us intervene at the local level. With better urban planning and greater citizen participations, we can make our hot cities cool again. This is by Joan Claus, Executive Director of UN Habitat. And according to SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe and resilient and sustainable. There are many targets, say for example, strong national and regional development planning, affordable and sustainable transport facilities, reduce the environmental impact of cities, provide access to safe and inclusive green and public spaces, and inclusive and sustainable urbanization. So these are targets. If you go detail into it, there are many actions can be taken by not only by central government and state government, but also by local authorities. Yeah. So for Malaysia, we have classified 4 major strategies or level. One is to reduce GHG at city level. This initiative done by local governments contribute to local actions. So we do a lot of engagement with local governments, a lot of incentives, a lot of assistance as well in order to do that. We would like to promote green growth using green technology, enhancing environmental sustainability through green growth, not only through energy sector, but also, say, for example, by changing the mode of public transport in the future, by changing the type of vehicles we are going to use in the near future. Yeah, that's very important. Government is expected to announce soon our commitments on enhancing non-internal combustion engines. Government must show our exemplary actions, so we have to do that. It's not me to announce it, but I hope that shortly government will announce it. Leverage on our rich biodiversity, maintain at least 50% of forests and tree covers in perpetuity in Malaysia. We have at the moment 55%, more than 55%, because forest is very important for carbon offsetting or sequestration. Quality of life to improve standard of living, ensure high quality of environment. When we have good environment, less cars on the street, less smoke, I believe that will help to increase the standard of living as well. So there are 4 drivers we would like to promote. One is zero waste to landfill. It means that a lot of circular economy activities taken place. This morning I had discussion on electronic waste. Zero electronic waste going to be, because we plan to improve the existing framework by having a special regulation on it, and that will be announced by government. Extensive urban greenery, energy efficiency and renewable energy, and low carbon mobility options. We promote cycling as well as walking. The easiest way to do it by using reserve land along the rivers in the country. So we have about 20 to 30 meters on both sides of the rivers. that can be used for building trails for people to use. So this is also what we are trying to do now. The key benefits, as usual, I'm not going to tell you all about it, but everyone knows that by having low carbon cities, we are expecting cleaner environment, cooler, healthier. This is a place where people can live, and then it's going to be more vibrant. And on top of that, this is a summary. This is my last slide, showing that low carbon cities framework in Malaysia. In particular, we have 4 elements for GHG reduction. We have 15 performance criteria and 41 sub-criteria. You can download Low Carbon Cities Framework Malaysia, so you can read. I'm very sure most of you are aware about this, and I'm happy to say, for example, to receive questions, if any. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the informative and interesting presentation. It is now with great pleasure and honor to acknowledge the gracious presence of Yang Berbahagia Datuk Seri Tan Planner Haji Mahadi bin Cengah, Mayor of Kuala Lumpur, to deliver his keynote address on Kuala Lumpur Carbon Neutral 2050. Datuk Seri Tan Planner Haji Mahadi bin Cengah was appointed as the 13th Mayor of Kuala Lumpur on October 1st, 2020. Prior to his appointment, he was advisor for the planning to the previous Mayor of Kuala Lumpur. Datuk Seri has served as Executive Director of Kuala Lumpur City Hall from 2017 until 2019, managing the project management and planning. He has also been given the responsibility to lead Kampung Baru Development Corporation, a corporation under the Ministry of Federal Territories from 2015 to 2017 as the Chief Executive Officer. Prior to 2015, Datuk Seri was the Director of Urban Planning Department of Kuala Lumpur City Hall for 10 years, from 2004 to 2014. He also a corporate member of Malaysian Institute of Planners, MIP, and registered town planner with the Board of Town Planners Malaysia. He received Bachelor's of Urban and Regional Planning from University of Technology Malaysia in 1983 and holds a master degree in Master of Science in the Urban Development of University of Strathclyde, Glasgow, United Kingdom in 1990. Please welcome Yang Berbahagia Datuk Seri Tan Planner Haji Mahadi to deliver the presentation. Datuk Seri, are you okay?
I'm okay. Can I leave now? I can wait for another half an hour.
Okay, thank you so much.
Please proceed.
Please welcome Yang Berbahagia Datuk Seri Tuan Planner Haji Mahathir to deliver the presentation.
Can I start?
Yeah, you can.
Can I start now, Azira?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Thank you, Puan Azira, for the kind introduction. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good afternoon and a big thank you to everyone for making time to join us today. Permit me to also extend my appreciation to the organizers of the 12th International Conference on World-Class Sustainable Cities 2021 for inviting me to share Kuala Lumpur's efforts towards becoming a carbon neutral city by 2050. Ladies and gentlemen, Kuala Lumpur has come a long way since its humble beginnings as a tin mining settlement in the 19th century. Since then, it has developed into an urban city with a growing population of 1.8 million, spread across 243 square kilometers. As the capital city of Malaysia and a signatory of the Paris Agreement on climate change, we are cognizant of the pressing demand to address environmental issues in the planning and management of our city. As such, and in line with our vision of developing Kuala Lumpur into a world-class, livable, sustainable, and resilient city for all, we have set a specific target for ourselves to become a carbon neutral city by 2050. On a daily basis, we work towards achieving this goal by implementing the learnings we have gained from the extensive studies and the focus group discussions we have conducted over the years. Our findings have culminated in the development of several master plans and blueprints, all of which are unified in their purpose of developing Kuala Lumpur into a carbon neutral city by 2050. Some of the notable plans which emphasize low carbon initiatives for Kuala Lumpur include Kuala Lumpur Low Carbon Society Blueprint 2030, Kuala Lumpur Smart City Master Plan 2030, and Kuala Lumpur Pedestrian and Cycling Master Plan 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, in pursuit of a carbon neutral Kuala Lumpur, we have ensured that our goals and plans are in step with current global sustainability movements. This includes incorporating and aligning our action plans with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I would like to share with you that Malaysia was ranked 65th in the Sustainable Development Report 2021. With the implementation of our action plans, it is my hope that Malaysia's ranking will improve in future reports. Beyond rankings, our action plans aim to address the consequences of climate change, which is now no stranger to Kuala Lumpur. The city has seen extraordinary rainfalls, rising temperatures, frequent occurrence of flash floods, and freak storms. Early this year, Kuala Lumpur has recorded 122 millimeters point of rainfall per hour. This doubled the normal amount of rainfall, which is only 60 millimeters per hour. Besides that, it was recorded that Kuala Lumpur has an increase of 1.64 degrees of Celsius over a 30-year period between December 1989 and October 2019. These outcomes are an undeniable reminder that carbon emission must be reduced in order to make Kuala Lumpur resilient to climate change. We have set a specific goal to create a balance between carbon emissions and carbon absorption via our Low Carbon Society Blueprint 2030 and Draft Structure Plan 2040. With these plans in place, we target to reduce more than 70% of carbon emission by 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, a comprehensive roadmap has been curated for Kuala Lumpur's journey towards becoming a carbon neutral city. The Low Carbon Society Blueprint 2030 outlines 10 main actions and 245 low carbon programs. These programs center on 5 core sectors, which are energy, waste, mobility, community, as well as green and open spaces. Ladies and gentlemen, the buy-in of the community and stakeholders is crucial for the successful implementation of these low-carbon programs. Visibility is key here. Nothing convinces people better than presenting actions and results. Bearing that in mind, we have taken the initiative to increase the installation of solar photovoltaic systems on Kuala Lumpur City Hall owned buildings and facilities. To further amplify our efforts, we are also collaborating with private companies to install solar PVs, and we are working on developing large-scale solar farming projects for Kuala Lumpur. Several potential locations have been identified for the project, including Wan Semaju and Kepong. Additionally, Kuala Lumpur City Hall recently imposed a regulation on real estate developers, which requires the utilization of at least 30% of renewable energy in their projects. Testament to the efficacy of these regulations are IKEA Ceras and the Duke Toll Plaza. We trust these efforts will move the needle in terms of promoting our goal of a carbon neutral city to the public and accelerating the use and adoption of renewable energy in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are all aware, the widespread use of private vehicles is also one of the main contributors of greenhouse gases, particularly in highly populated urban areas such as Kuala Lumpur. Acknowledging this unfortunate fact, we have earmarked Wan Semaju for our pilot carbon neutral growth center project. This project spans 11 square kilometers or 4% of the city's total expanse. Located at the northeast end of Kuala Lumpur, this project will promote the use of public transportation and electric vehicles. In line with our goals, we will enhance feeder bus routes to ease mobility and convenience for the public. Additionally, a free electric bus service, Go KL, will be made available by the end of the year. With these steps in place, the Wan Semaju Carbon Neutral Growth Center will undoubtedly transform a dormant suburban center into a thriving, prosperous, and livable carbon neutral growth center. Ladies and gentlemen, to further mitigate carbon emissions from transportation, a new bicycle and pedestrian network lined with shady trees has also been incorporated into the Wan Semaju Carbon Neutral Growth Center. There are also plans for a comprehensive and accessible infrastructure to accommodate electric vehicle charging stations. Presently, an additional 15 kilometers of a new green network is being constructed to link Wan Semaju and residential areas such as Damansara Heights, Kenny Hills, and Bansal Hills to the Kuala Lumpur Central Business District. Other low carbon programs under the Wan Semaju Carbon Neutral Growth Center include developing new neighborhood parks, building a new solid waste recycling center, and imposing a rainwater harvesting system for new development projects. As the first eco-conscious township in Kuala Lumpur, Wan Semaju will play a decisive role in our carbon neutral journey. Wan Semaju will serve as symbol of aspiration for other growth centers in the transition towards carbon neutrality by 2050. Ladies and gentlemen, to provide all of you with a better visualization of our journey towards becoming a carbon neutral city, I would like to share with you our projected carbon reductions over a 10-year period. For this plan to be successful, obtaining accurate data is imperative. To that end, a city-wide greenhouse gas inventory development, capacity building, and facilitation program has been established to track and analyze all sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Kuala Lumpur. Utilizing the findings of this program, we hope to develop a comprehensive climate action plan based on concrete data, actual hotspots, individual emitters, as well as heat islands. Indeed, the involvement of the community and all stakeholders is vital in making Kuala Lumpur a carbon neutral city by 2050. To this end, findings from the greenhouse gas inventory report will be shared with all relevant parties to ensure that everyone is able to play their part in managing energy and water usages as well as waste generation. The greenhouse gas inventory report will be treated as an important baseline study that, with support from federal agencies, will enable us to guide industries in enhancing resource efficiency, creating a green circular economy, and further exploring new green growth. Ladies and gentlemen, Kuala Lumpur City Hall aims to lead by example. We have initiated several changes within our working environment to encourage a low-carbon lifestyle among our workforce. To promote the use of public transportation, we have provided employees who regularly commute to work utilizing public transportation with free My30 passes. We are also exploring the possibility of closing off parking spaces every Friday to encourage the use of public transportation, walking, or cycling to commute to work. Additionally, employees are also encouraged to dress lightly so as to avoid the need for air conditioning. I would like to once again emphasize that in order to achieve our vision of a carbon neutral city, collective efforts are a must. We place emphasis on outreach programs to engage with different groups of stakeholders in implementing low carbon programs. Partnership, inclusivity, and equality are crucial for successful implementation. In the past, Kuala Lumpur City Hall has cooperated with the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, University Technology Malaysia, Wan Sesari Residents Association, Sustainable Energy Development Authority Malaysia, and public schools, to name a few. We also encourage collaboration programs between schools to educate the youth about their roles in combating climate change. I was informed that Sekolah Menengah Kebangsaan Perempuan Air Panas Kuala Lumpur and Fujimi Gaoka High School for Girls, Shibuyaku, Tokyo, are collaborating to enhance their understanding and knowledge on low carbon lifestyles. This form of engagement is indeed vital in order to encourage low carbon practices from an early age. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to share a short video clip with all of you. In line with our vision of Kuala Lumpur as a city for all, and as shown on screen, we discriminate against no one, much less the needy. In fact, we believe that they too must be empowered. Through various engagement exercises, we have managed to empower the homeless community to run their own urban farms. Aside from harvesting the crops for their individual consumption, they can also benefit from selling these plants to their surrounding local communities. Indirectly, this not only ensures their food security, but it also reduces carbon emissions in the city by planting vegetation and fulfilling the needs of the locality. Ladies and gentlemen, we have all felt and seen the effects of greenhouse gases within our city. As the mayor of Kuala Lumpur, I invite all of you to join the fight against climate change by supporting the city's low carbon efforts. Understandably, making changes to our lifestyle to reduce our carbon footprint may seem like a challenge for many, impossible even. However, if there is one thing that we can learn from the recent pandemic, it is that we are indeed capable of adapting. It is only through a continuous lifestyle change embraced by all that we will be able to truly be a carbon neutral city by 2050. Together, we move closer towards realizing our vision of Kuala Lumpur as a sustainable and resilient city for all. Wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you and terima kasih.
Thank you Yang Berbahagia Datuk Seri Haji Mahadi for the updates and sharing on KL roadmap moving forward neutral carbon by 2030. WCSC 2021 would like to thank both Datuk Seri Zaidi and Datuk Seri Mahadi for the insightful keynote sharing. Any question for both keynote speakers can be shared in the Q&A box and Secretariat will forward to the respective speakers. Answer will be emailed back after we coordinate accordingly. Now, moving on, let's get some insight into the first paper for this afternoon, representing the Cycling Embassy of Denmark and Guild Architect, Mr. Esben Neander Christensen, to present the second paper, entitled Sustainable Urban Mobility. Esben Neander Christensen is the director and team lead of Guild from Copenhagen, Denmark. He has worked with a broad range of public and private clients, focusing on urban strategy, mobility, large-scale urban design, and master planning. He is driven by a curiosity about understanding and fostering good and inviting places, districts, and cities. His work is also based on a pragmatic and idealistic approach, linking the Guild analytical toolbox to design at all scale with a strong focus on people. Esben has been responsible for numerous projects in Europe, Latin America, North America, Australia, with more than 15 years of work experience spanning urban design, strategy, architecture, and interior design. Please welcome Mr. Esben Neander Christensen.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to add to the list that we're working a lot in Malaysia and Southeast Asia at the moment as well. So quite a few things ongoing. So let me just put this full screen. There we go. Thank you so much for having me. It's really interesting to be part of this event, especially in light of the last thing I mentioned, that we're doing a lot of work at the moment in the region of Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. I wanted to talk a little bit about our approach to sustainable urban mobility and our approach to design in general, where we really like to put a holistic perspective on things. And that could either be a holistic perspective that talks about people first, but it could also be sometimes one that even talks about life first. So I'll explain a little bit what that actually means. So Selamat tengah hari. Hi Maya. Hi is the Danish version. I'm sitting here in Copenhagen at the moment, and luckily I got in on the afternoon session for this because it's a very nice 9 a.m. here, so nice and easy. We're Ghg. We're an office that work with urban strategy, mobility, analysis, design, master planning, and process facilitation. We're in 3 different places at the moment. Most of us are in Copenhagen, and that's also where we work with a lot of, for instance, our local collaboration partners in Malaysia, in Australia, in Latin America, and so on. But we also have 2 US offices in San Francisco and New York. We're very diverse in terms of background. We do have a sort of backbone of design and architecture and planning, but we also have quite a lot of representation within systems thinking, mobility, social sciences, and so on, to sort of all the work that Mr. Ghg has been doing throughout the years has always been about being multidisciplinary. So we're really trying to push that forward in our practice as well. And we've actually worked in a whole range of different cities around the world. And that's quite interesting because we get to compare across and we get to use some of our experiences from one place in another. And we don't always just have to go, you know, this is our local context and then showing examples of what happens in Northern Europe or North America and so on. But we can actually show and talk about examples about how things work. For instance, comparing Southeast Asia to other parts of the world that might have certain similar characteristics. And sometimes that's surprising what that means. So this is Jan. Jan Ghg is a professor of architecture and wrote some very good books. He's now 85 years old. He just had his birthday. But Jan essentially started the company after having been a professor at the Copenhagen Architecture School and numerous other universities over the years. And the reason why he began doing all this work of looking into what creates good cities for people, it started kind of as a love story for him, right? Jan wanted to, this is a nice picture in the 60s, the handsome gentleman on the right of your screen is Jan. Ingrid, his wife, is a behavioral psychologist, and she would essentially ask Jan this question: why are architects not interested in people? Why do you design all these places that are completely alien? A child walks home and they won't be able to see what house they're in because all the doors look the same, all the buildings look the same, all the open spaces look the same, and so on. And this was a lot of the stuff that was being built back then. And Jan was sort of, as everyone else in our profession, he was doing a lot of this stuff. So that led to a sort of professional quest for him to look into the answer for some of these things, because he found out very quickly that we don't have a lot of research on people and our relationship with our natural habitat, which is the city. We know more about polar bears or wolves or, you know, many species of animals than we actually know about, or we knew more than we knew about ourselves as human beings. So a number of years passed by with a lot of really good books, academic research, and so on. But it all boils down to this pretty simple statement that we as human beings experience our environment at eye level using all of our senses. So we should also think of design and planning in that sense. And we should understand that the experience part is actually something that's the most important thing, because the subjective nature of being in an environment really means this is how we are. We are human beings, we are biological beings in the end. So this has led to an approach that we like to promote, which is about people first, but also about life first, increasingly, as we start to focus much more, or have been focusing much more on ecosystems and sustainability and so on. And an important saying here is that we measure what we care about. So maybe 30 years ago, it would be very strange to find a city that had good data on pedestrian usage of public space. They would have good numbers on traffic. They would have good numbers on the types of cars and vehicles that would transit any given space, but they actually wouldn't know much about all the other aspects. This is something that has actually changed, and a lot of cities have begun collecting this type of data. But the issue is, if you only collect data on traffic, you will only design for traffic because you're not seeing all the other factors. So we're very much into a perspective of saying, well, life first, people first, then we look at the types of spaces that we can design and implement to support the life and to support a nice urban experience for people. And then buildings and transport and so on is something that plugs into that as well. But it's very much about the spatial experiences and the personal experiences of people. So it has to do with looking at planning and design based on understanding things more in isolation. You do a landscape plan, you do a mobility plan, you do a land use plan, you do a plan that shows densities in buildings and so on. It's actually much more about combining all these aspects with a really strong element of sustainability as well, to this holistic approach and an approach that's centered around life and centered around people. And that also includes financials and all of the other elements as well. I'm here on actually a lovely late summer day in Copenhagen. It's sort of like 18, maybe 20 degrees today, which is quite nice for this time of year, late September. But the image kind of says it all, right? I mean, that culture and climate are very different things across the global scale. What we find interesting is that when we measure a lot of human behavior, we can actually see that a lot of it is similar. There might be tiny variances between what happens in one place and another, but a lot of elements of human behavior are actually simple. I mean, this situation shown in this photo, sitting next to a nice wall that's been heated up by the sun and having a coffee, that's actually something that's nice no matter what culture you're in. So our behavior is in many ways universal as human beings. So we haven't changed physiology for hundreds or thousands of years, but what has actually changed is our cities. So this is a classic photo of sort of urban sprawl or expanse, but I mean, this is a condition that you can find in more or less controlled terms all around the world. So our cities have become much less dense and much larger in general. And even the places that have historically been dense in terms of building capacity, they have a much lower density of people than what they used to. There are a few exceptions to the rule, but this is sort of the general picture that we're seeing all across a number of different cities and a number of different regions in the world. And what happens then is that many spaces are simply too large and uninviting with not that many users. So you get this condition of sort of a ghost town effect where people literally do not feel invited and they don't feel the spaces are attractive because there are so few people there often. This is something that, again, doesn't matter where you are in the world. You can find good examples of this for various reasons. Maybe it's hostile microclimate. Maybe it's too few users and too little programming. It could be many different things. So the big thing is we don't necessarily have to spend as much time in the public space as we used to. A lot of people nowadays don't have the need to go out into public space, to go to the market, to do work, to do various things. You can actually stay either in your vehicle or you can stay in sort of specific zones of the city and don't really go to the places where everyone else goes to. So urban life is very much about creating inviting high quality spaces. And also for people that have to go out and spend time in public space due to all these reasons, we need to create nice and inviting and attractive and dignified experiences for that as well. So the burning platform is that the urban growth is enormous. So these are WHO numbers, I believe, but by 2050, we'll have 70% of the world's population living in cities. I think Malaysia is one of the countries that actually has a higher percentage than that already. So in that sense, you might be living a little bit in the future for the rest of the world. And our question is then, how do we design and also sometimes redesign inviting life first cities, district spaces, and mobility systems? So we work a lot with understanding place and context. We work a lot with understanding how do we behave, how do we move through the city. what are sort of the lines that have been drawn up for us, and how do we actually organically move through the city as human beings? How can we use observation and analysis to understand public life, understand quantities of people moving through different spaces and what that means for the spatial configurations? This is an interesting example. At this point, the busiest street section that we had ever measured in terms of pedestrians per hour was on Broadway in New York, in the US. And we did a project in Mexico City where we actually came up with higher numbers than that, but in a street that has never had any sort of, people didn't perceive it as a nice place to walk, but it just had an immense amount of footfall and capacity actually too. So how can you work with that potential to create a new situation and a new way of looking at the street as a green corridor, a pedestrian corridor, as an attractive place to spend time? We do a lot of eye level measuring, meeting people on the ground. It's not always enough to have GIS data and observation, and there are so many technical ways to collect data, but it's actually really important to get out and see what happens on the ground. But we also use all these big data sets, sociodemographics, online surveys, traffic data, all the nice things that we can get from social media, from Google and so on about behavior. We also try to understand how the spaces are within those places and how the spaces link to how people move through the city. The ecology that we're part of, the water, the landscape, the environment, the quality of the air that we breathe, which has a big impact on mobility as well. How comfortable it is to walk. How we can use a good microclimate to actually invite people to walk more and spend more time outside, and maybe don't drive those last 500 meters, but actually park in a bigger parking facility and walk the last stretch away to your home or your place of work. How do we shop? How do we access food? So what's interesting here is that mobility is not just about moving; it's about a lot of other things, and it's linked to a lot of things about how we function biologically and how our day-to-day works. How do we relate to water? And how do we understand place and build value? And how do we also understand that movement and mobility is about much more than just going from point A to point B. It's also all the other experiences that happen in between. So all of this is more a methodology approach, but we're also very much keen on defining a vision, a larger scale vision that's about values. Because we know that it's really important for cities to have a strategic sort of North Star and have a way of understanding how all the different projects that a city or another planning entity goes through, that they should all lead somewhere in particular, and they should all be going in the same direction. And it's very easy to go down into sort of this tactical project-based approach where you're looking at one project in isolation and not looking at how it fits into the bigger picture. A lot of that also has to do with engaging with stakeholders, engaging with communities to define the collective vision, define the challenges and opportunities. Sometimes it's about having a vision and using people to actually make that vision hit the ground and try to look at it in terms of what is the vision and what's the reality of the place and how can you mitigate those 2 points. Sometimes it's about flexibility, and this is something that we're seeing a lot lately, that it's harder and harder to do long-term planning, but it's the question is, how do we even begin? So how could be different models of addressing the future based on an approach? How could that work? And really, this is all about ensuring that the potentials of a place in the widest sense of the word are realized and also expanded. And how can we do that with mobility as a driver as well? We're very much about human scale design action in multiple different levels. So I'll show you a few examples now of what mobility actually means, because we don't only work with mobility projects, we also work with master planning and design. We work with public space, public life data projects. We work with urban strategy and mobility, and also sometimes with purely process-driven projects. So for the space of mobility, for us, it's much more about a holistic approach, as mentioned. It's about there's more to transport than transport. There's more than movement from A to B. It can be a driver for city transformation. It can be strategically driven, but in the longer term, but also in the short-term projects, you can work with many different ways of trying out long-term visions in the short term. we should always focus on all user groups and understand the user groups that are, and not just make assumptions, because that's quite easy to do. And very often the data will prove that our assumptions are actually not necessarily correct in terms of who uses transit and so on, and how do they use them. We should focus on mobility for people and not necessarily vehicles as a starting point. And we should also use and develop the link between public spaces and mobility. A city will typically be made up of something like 30% streets. So it's a really big resource in terms of having good spaces, good public spaces for people, if we think of the streets as public spaces as well. This can be done through vision and strategy. It can be done through conceptual designs of streets and station environments, down to construction documentation. It can be done through master planning with integrated mobility. It could be done sometimes through projects that are much more about looking into the future. What are some of the things that are happening in the future of mobility? And it can be about looking at the split of different transit modes. How can we actually facilitate people using many different transit modes, and also integrating micromobility in a way that's not as problematic as we've actually seen in some cases, unfortunately. So for us, mobility, if mobility works, it means that it works for people. It means that people actually get a good daily experience out of it. And it's often the little things. I mean, here is a little reclining element that you can actually stand next to on your bike when you're waiting at a red light. And that's a tiny little detail. It doesn't cost much, but it makes a very big difference in terms of experience. It makes it much nicer to actually be biking in that space. It's about not necessarily being about one specific place. It can be, and it's also about understanding that places are systems, and there's a sort of a wider network of places that we can connect through mobility. We can expand, for instance, this notion of the 15-minute city that's come up a lot lately. We can expand on that through the intelligent uses of mobility. Then it's about making the good choice at a city level, or at a societal level, or at a planetary level, making the good choice the easy choice for each and every one of us as individuals. See, this is what I will be going through in about 3 or 4 months. Not too often, fortunately, because we don't get that much snow, but every once in a while we'll have one of these days. And if it takes me 45 minutes to drive and find a parking space, and I can do this in 10 minutes, then I will always opt for the short version in terms of time. And it's okay that you have to brave the temperature. It could either be cold weather or hot weather for 10 minutes, because it's just so much easier in terms of time. Mobility is usually also a social experience. It's something that we can do together. It's something where you meet people. It's something where that can also be frustrating, but you actually get a little bit of a different space where you're not rushing as much, and you can see people in a different way. And access to mobility is very much economic mobility. So when people can move around, that gives them access to different and new opportunities. And this is a really big issue in some of the markets where we're working, where access can actually mean that people have to go several hours each way per day to just get to their places of employment. So can we actually work with that in a way where we can promote a fairer and more just way of living and earning a living at a global level? And again, the easy choice, the sustainable choice. If we make the easy choice the most sustainable choice, then it's very much also a driver of climate strategy. So if we can reduce vehicular emissions, and we can actually make the way that we move around cities much more, much nicer to our planet, putting it simply, then we're also going a long way towards boosting sort of an inherent level of climate strategy. So there's a lot of sustainability DNA within providing a good framework for human scale or soft mobility. And then the last interesting thing is that soft mobility can also unlock a lot of new uses of land and buildings. Mexico City has been an interesting case, because they said some years ago that we will take the parking minimums as stipulated by law, and we will make them into maximums. A very sort of simple, if you think about it, legal hack of a very big mobility driver, but it has a range of very complex consequences, both in terms of challenges, but also in terms of new potentials, new types of buildings, new types of offices, new types of retail experiences, new types of neighborhood centers that can actually be enabled because you don't have to accommodate a lot of parking and you don't have to necessarily accommodate a lot of cars in the same way that you would have to do in the past. So this is a completely new way. I mean, this particular building was actually parking, the 2 lower floors, and it was offices up top. And now all of a sudden you can use the ground floors for something else, because with a new parking norm, you can obtain permits for something that just wasn't feasible and possible in the past. So an interesting example of how mobility can also change land use and change building functions. A few examples of projects where we work with this. This is an urban strategy and people-first mobility strategy that we work with in a new town in Luxembourg called Kirchberg. Kirchberg is an EU city. It has a bunch of very large-scale European Union offices and high-rises and so on. And this was very much a part of a bigger project. So both having a public space network plan, a good framework, having a toolbox, having guidelines for how to deliver the plan, and having cases looking at strategies and tools for how this has been done in other places so that you can communicate and talk about it and understand what are some of the first steps to do and actually in order to actually implement this and start to make our first steps towards a more sustainable mobility future. And in this case, we did a lot of work in understanding the working conditions, the traveling conditions, what happened throughout the seasons, how do people bike, how do people walk, how do people take public transit, what are some of the links between a land use model that's much more looking at something in terms that looks more like the 60s and the way that people move around. So it's very interesting to see that sometimes the physical configurations of the space will also drive our mobility choices. How do you park if you're actually brave enough to go out biking? How can you store your bike and make sure that it doesn't get stolen? Are there bike share systems? Then we looked at defining a vision and all the different steps for getting to the vision. And once you get into sort of step maybe 4 or 5, it begins to become much more flexible because it can go in many different directions. And in this particular project, we're in the process of capturing that at the moment. Then looking into what could be a to-do list for sequencing, for looking at all these different choices of mobility to actually make sure that we do the right things first and make sure that we get the most impact with our early decisions and the early changes made to the system. And then plugging that into a longer term public space network plan. And on purpose, we're here not using the word mobility because it's about much more than that. It's actually about the quality and the attractiveness of a place and of all the public spaces. And mobility is one component of that. But it's a much wider sense of how do we exist in this natural habitat of city. We move, but we also spend time. And those two things are very much interrelated. And then looking into some of the early things that can be done. And these were fairly simple interventions with paint and so on, and changing car lanes to dual lane bike carriageways and so on. And then you can slowly add on more complexity and add on more sort of harder to do things in terms of scope of works and so on. So that's one example. Another example of a type of project would be within sort of a more master planning and design space, which is some of the very complex projects because they encompass layers of all the other different types of projects that we do. There will be urban strategy elements, there will be mobility elements, there will be public space elements, there will be data, foodscape, sustainability, everything else, a lot of process as well. So an ongoing project that we have at the moment in Chile, in Santiago, it's called Huechuraba in the north of Santiago. And it's actually right on the edge. So this is technically it's brownfield, but it's been planted over with soybean just to keep it keep an interim use. But it is technically ex-industrial land and it is fairly polluted. So there's also a cleanup effort that has to be made. And this is a place where your typical relationship with hills and nature is something like this. You build a wall on the edge of the last development and you close yourself off towards this. And this is actually an extremely interesting and beautiful setting. You can go hiking up in these hills. This is the foothills of the Andes. It changes a lot depending on the seasons. The topography is amazing. The views are amazing. The climate is nicer once you get a bit further up. The air is fresher, it's cooler, and so on. But the city just hasn't embraced it as much, only in certain parts of the city, but definitely not here. So we looked at all the natural assets on site, like all the existing trees, wet areas, concentrations of trees, topography that's interesting, and so on, and used them as a starting point for a framework of public spaces. So starting with nature first. We also looked at the city in terms of how it has traditionally been developed in terms of land use. This was a city that was very much about courtyards because of the climate. It was about a block and a grid structure at a human scale of some 60, 70, 80 meters. And then the next question in this case, and this is where it goes a little bit off mobility, but it becomes more about master planning. But those things are again very interrelated. When you start linking those and start putting out human scale blocks, adding that with the nature element that we had before, and combining in the fact that this is a place that sits on the terminus of a metro station. You have a major highway here. You have 3 socioeconomically very different zones around. You have a cable car coming in from the south here as well in the future. You're all of a sudden sitting on a connection point in the north of the city. And this is actually a new centrality that can connect very different neighborhoods if we make the right mobility choices. And if we start to also implement and not just think of this master plan as something that happens within the site boundary, but it's also something that sort of shoots out tentacles, if you will, and grabs onto all the surrounding neighborhoods. So we can begin to use it as a vehicle for integration. So it's a mobility project, but in a sense, it's also a community building project because you're beginning to create a shared platform for very different areas in terms of social demographics, socioeconomics, and so on, that can then get a new common space that hasn't necessarily existed before in this part of the city, because this is much more about isolated bubbles and people not necessarily having too much of a relationship with one another. And you take that down to the neighborhood level where we look at where are the places where cars can go and the bigger mobility and public transit will happen. Where do you bike? But what are also some of the places that are much more about walking, moving, but spending time in a high quality public realm and being able to spend time there without necessarily worrying about a bike hitting you or a car having to go by and so on, and really working with that concept and embracing nature and really having this concept of mobility being about public space and streets also being about essentially being public spaces that we need to leverage and expand on in our understanding of the word, and connecting that to nature as well. So that's an example of a master plan urban development project with mobility very much being a driving element in all the aspects of all the choices that we take in terms of design. If we work with human scale blocks and say that 60 to 80 meters is a good dimension, it's because we know that it's easy for people to move through as pedestrians. It creates an interesting environment. If we create an interesting environment, it actually facilitates that people walk. People are much more likely to walk when there's something nice to look at, both at a facade level, at a block level, and at a city level. And the last little example that I wanted to give you, this is the project that we're working on actually here locally, very close to where I'm sitting in Copenhagen, with the city of Copenhagen, with a foundation called Bernard van Leer, and with Google. And this is about understanding air quality and the relationship between air quality and public space mobility. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a 3-year-old, so your eye level is much lower, it's about 1 meter. I have a 3-year-old myself right now, he's 102 centimeters tall. So you're about 1 meter above ground. It looks very different. You're much closer to where fumes are coming out of cars and so on. It's a very different world. And one of the things that there's actually data on to support is that we have, small children are quite vulnerable to poor air quality. They breathe up to 4 times as fast as adults, so they take in much more polluted air. So in this case, we looked at collecting air quality data and looking at where small people move through the city to go to school, to go to all the things that they need to do in their daily life. And then we looked at how can we reduce exposure and invite children to spend time in places where air quality is better. So we measured the particles. This is a city that has a lot of diesel, so unfortunately, UFPs is actually a fairly substantial issue. We measured and looked at where people walk through the city, and then we tried to figure out where can we begin to reduce pollution and air particles, and where can we invite kids to spend more time, because these are active spaces that have less exposure to pollution. And then using that to define a clean air network for mobility for school kids specifically. But I mean, this is something that you can actually integrate into the thinking at many different kinds of levels. How can we then, at a tactical level, begin to look at specific elements that can remove particles from the air, create more distance towards cars, maybe remove some of the traffic and so on. So a specific example, and I have about 1 minute left. So zooming out a little bit, why we're doing all this? Well, we think at all these different types of projects, be it mobility, master planning, urban strategy, whatever it is, we need to put life and people at the center of decision making. It should be about life. It should be about us as people. We think that the human scale, the experience, and life should be the starting point of anything we do. It's more than just mixing uses or looking at land use and so on. It's actually about creating pieces of city that integrate all these different layers and all these different types of thinking. It's about public space and mobility being at the heart of a more enjoyable urban daily life. So more than going from point A to B, but it's actually all the different nice experiences that can happen in between if we allow for it to happen. It's about creating places that are more equitable, healthy, and sustainable. And also embracing that mobility sometimes is also about food. It's about a lot of different other aspects. And I think a really important thing is, can we use mobility, can we use design to create new urban common grounds for people to meet? So we're in a world where we're sort of drifting apart. We have our bubbles, we have our social media. Some people exist in some places virtually and physically, some other people exist in other places. And the shared platforms that we have as societies are sort of being challenged more and more. So can we reintroduce some thinking around that and actually make it attractive and inviting for people to spend time together, also with people who aren't necessarily just like them? And we think that's a very, very important point to all of this. So, terima kasih, tak, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Asbanian de Christensen, for the informative and interesting presentation. If participants have any question, please raise in the Q&A box below and will be addressed during the panel discussion after the next paper presentation. May I now invite the second speaker on paper entitled Share the Road Program by Ms. Carly Gilbert-Patrick, representing the United Nations Environmental Program, in short, UNEP. Ms. Carly Gilbert-Patrick manages the UNEP team for active mobility, digitalization, mode integration, working with countries around the world to decouple mobility from increasing emission. Carly has been working in the field of sustainable mobility for almost 15 years in the areas of active mobility, road safety, bus rapid transit, congestion charging, low emission zone, bike share system, and digitalization. Prior to her time with UN Environment, Carly was the program manager for the UN Habitat Sustainable Transport for East African Cities program, supported by the Global Environment Fund. Before moving to Kenya, Carly worked for the Transport for London, supporting design, implementation, and launch of the London Cycle Hire Scheme and the London Low Emission Zone. She is also a council member of the World Economic Forum Future Council on Mobility and a board member of the Float Initiative. Please welcome Ms. Carly Gilbert-Patrick.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Or good morning, depending on where you are. It's great to be here with you today. I hope, can you see my slides okay? I just want to check. Azira, are my slides showing okay?
It is, but you have to like full screen. Can you? Yeah, that's great.
Is that okay?
It's better.
Okay,
All
great.
right.
Okay, super. Thank you. I think the first thing I want to say is thanks to Esben for setting me up nicely. I think a lot of what he's presented and his thoughts will complement my own. As I was introduced, I'm working with UN Environment Programme, very focused on working with governments to prioritise the needs of pedestrians and cyclists around the world, as well as looking at digitalisation and mobility. So I'd really just like to share some thoughts with you on this topic of why sharing the road matters. And, you know, I always, whenever you see car adverts, we're kind of sold this dream of, you know, grabbing the keys, jumping in the most amazing flashy car, driving on a beautiful road with no traffic. For some reason, you're always the only person in a car. And of course, the reality is very, very different. And, you know, it's embedded in our kind of culture or society that somehow having a car equates success. But when you look at the impact of not sharing the road and prioritizing car use, you see how dangerous things are looking, if you like. And when we look at the world population, we can see that by 2050, you know, from 1980 to 2050, we're looking at doubling of the world population. And we heard already previously that within that, the urban population is also looking pretty huge. And actually, as of 2015, we hit a world milestone where more people around the world live in urban areas than do not. You know, one of the things that we're really focused on in UNEP is the impact of all of the decisions that governments and citizens are making that impact our planet. And the science is really clear that we are in the midst of a triple planetary crisis. We're affecting nature, climate, biodiversity loss, and air pollution. And in a way, there's a thread that's running through this crisis, which is unsustainable production and consumption. Now, the International Resource Panel has consistently reminded us that our relentless and unlimited extraction of resources from the earth is having a devastating impact on the natural world. And it's that real critical junction that we're at, where we have to be thinking about how we can do things differently, rather than just taking and taking and taking resources. And I guess where I'm going with this is that transport definitely has a lot to answer for and its own role to play. And you can see from this slide that car growth is at an all-time high, but not only that, it's forecasted to continue to grow. And you can see by 2050, we're looking at almost 2.5 billion light-duty vehicles on our roads. So, you know, what does all of this mean for sharing the road, and why should we be sharing the road better than we are right now? We look a bit more closely at some of the transport stats. You can see this graph from the latest UNEP emissions gap report, which identifies transport as one of the 6 largest emitting sectors. So it's really up there as one of the areas that we need to address. And not only that, but transport is contributing 22% of global emissions. And within that, 73% of that is coming from cars and trucks. When we flip over and look at air quality, transport is also one of the main sources of air pollution, with outdoor air pollution largely coming from vehicles and industry. You can see, you know, a pretty scary statistic that 80% of people in cities are breathing outside of the WHO, World Health Organization guidelines. I think the area that many of us are really aware of is road safety. And in the Asia and Pacific region, road safety is really at epidemic proportions. This figure is the daily number of people losing their lives in the Asia and Pacific region. You know, that's 2,000 mums, dads, brothers, sisters, friends, aunties, you know, real people, 2,000 people every day. By the time this conference is over, another 2,000 people in the Asia region have died from road fatalities. And that's, of course, not even counting the many more people sustaining serious life-changing injuries. The other thing that's really quite interesting, and we heard this from the previous speaker, that actually, you know, it's all about human design and focusing on the needs of people. And actually, for many people around the world, walking and cycling is free, and it's quite often their only option for getting around. They may not be able to afford the bus. They definitely couldn't afford a car. So walking and cycling needs to be safe. So for the majority who this is their only option, they can do it with respect and dignity and in comfort. So now, kind of, you know, those are some of the issues. Let's have a look a bit at what the solutions are. So many of you may know this model, and it's a starting point. I like to see the avoid, shift and improve framework really as a starting point for thinking about transport. So number one, designing our cities and spaces to reduce the need to travel in the first place. And I think COVID has really shone the light on the fact that we don't all need to be moving around every day. Number two is very much about shifting people, shifting citizens to more sustainable modes and maintaining modal share for those sustainable modes where you have it. Where I live in Nairobi, 70% of people are already walking and cycling. So the work we're doing here with the city is not so much about shifting people to walking and cycling, it's about keeping it safe and comfortable so all of those people who are already walking and cycling continue to do so. And then improving, so where we are using vehicles, making sure we prioritize clean technology and increase efficiency. I think, you know, focusing in on walking and cycling active mobility as a near zero emission mode of transport, walking and cycling move 6 to 8 times more people per hour in the same space as a car. And it's looking at the least noise and air pollution, requiring no use of fossil fuels, and has health benefits. It's really what we call the kind of win-win of transport. And you can see from this image how little space walking and cycling takes up compared to cars. One of the areas that I think we often forget to talk about is also rural transport. And especially in rural areas, walking and cycling provides access quite often to the peri-urban areas and to cities. So, you know, prioritizing investment in sustainable mobility is really critical, and it has to include walking and cycling, of course, linked to good public transport and also making sure vehicles are clean. And we're seeing a real big kind of electric mobility transition at the moment. So I wanted to just share with you the work that we're doing at UNEP. The Share the Road project we're running is very much promoting walking and cycling, like I mentioned, but we also have other projects that are looking across this avoid, shift and improve paradigm. So we're really trying to work with governments and other stakeholders to make sure that we're looking at the holistic sustainable mobility spectrum and focusing across different areas. Because of course, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, mobility really has a contributing effort to many of the goals. What I wanted to do now is just really touch on a case study or just to kind of share an example. Sometimes this can all be very theoretical. So just giving the example of Indonesia, really demonstrating, if you like, a change in approach to transport planning and transport thinking and transport policy. So in 2019, 57% of Indonesian citizens lived in urban areas. And it's also estimated that 68% of the Indonesian population will live in urban areas by 2025. So it's making Indonesian cities among the fastest growing in the world. But with this growing population, of course, has seen an increase in the number of motorized vehicles. So you can see here from 1995 to 2014, the reported increase of cars and motorbikes with a really significant growth rate, which has led to pollution and traffic congestion and road fatalities. So all of those issues I talked about earlier. There's chronic congestion due to the growing number of vehicles in the country, and there are 125 million vehicles on Indonesian roads, according to the latest data, and that's an increase of 300% from the 30 million registered vehicles in 2004. So there's been this real kind of car-centric congestion. Let's design and build more roads for cars, more congestion, design and build more roads for cars. And like in many developing countries, this domination by private vehicles has made just crossing the street for pedestrians a life and death experience. So there's been a real lack, if you like, of spatial planning and a fragmented approach to designing and building sidewalks. There's been no real strategy to prioritize pedestrians, and I think it's an issue that many cities find themselves in. There's so much congestion, so they keep building more roads to help with that congestion. And I can safely say that so far there is no one city that has dealt with its congestion problems successfully by building more roads for cars. So to tackle this challenge in Indonesia, we at UNEP, along with the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, worked with the Ministry of Public Works and Housing to really kind of set a new vision for how Indonesia wanted to design and plan its transport systems. And we worked with them to develop their national vision for non-motorized transport. The strategy aims to create a safe and comfortable and inclusive and comprehensive walking and cycling space. Now, sometimes, you know, we get a lot of discussion about, do we need new policies? There are enough policies. There's no point having a policy without implementation, which is all very true. But actually, it's what I always say, it's the journey of developing the policy in consultation that is the necessary and important step. It's not the final product necessarily, but it's going through that thought process and the arguments and the debates for how to prioritize and what do we want to put down in the policy. It's that process which is important. So the policies in place, we're really seeing increased investment. There's also a new greenway and public bike project from Indonesia where they're improving all of the walking and cycling space linked to the bus rapid transit to really give good, safe feeder services. And at a city level, Jakarta has also developed its own design guidelines, kind of sitting underneath this national policy with a 5-year implementation plan. So I think, you know, Indonesia is a really good example of a very complex situation where there was a very car-focused planning approach. And through good leadership and support, they're now taking steps to kind of really rethink how they design their cities and how they plan for transport. I think the other thing that I wanted to touch on was some kind of more high level points around things that make a difference. So the work I do, we're working with cities and national governments all over the world to prioritize pedestrians and cyclists. And there are some countries that do better, work faster, get where they need to be better than others. And I think these are the things that I've seen that really help make that difference. So one is having good champions and leadership. So quite often your official entry point would say be the Ministry of Transport or the Ministry of Planning, but often your leader or your person who's really going to stand up and push and be brave and do things differently doesn't necessarily sit in the kind of official government agency. It might be the head of a local NGO working on women's rights or road safety, or it might be an engineer in the city planning department. But one thing that countries which do things differently have in common is there is a leader, there's a champion, and finding that champion or asking yourself in the audience, are you that champion for prioritizing the needs of pedestrians and cyclists really makes a difference. The other area is having a policy. So putting down on paper the vision for your country or city on pedestrians and cyclists. Now, quite often governments have national transport policies, of course, or city sustainable mobility plans, but often active mobility has been overlooked for so long. It really needs a kind of focused policy prioritizing it and raising it up to the level of the other modes of transport. And along with that policy, actually having a budget set aside. Nairobi is another example where they, within their Nairobi city policy for walking and cycling, they actually said all of the money that we get in for transport, whether that's from parking fees or our national budget allocation, we are going to spend at least 20% on the needs of pedestrians and cyclists because they make up 70% of the main mode of transport. So the least we can do is invest 20% in their needs. And actually having that kind of commitment enshrined in actual committed budget makes a difference. You can have a fantastic policy, but if you have no money to implement, then obviously you don't get very far. I think the other thing is governments and civil society holding account the global development world. You know, there are lots of development projects for highways and road construction, and it's really important that governments ask when they're getting these loans and grants that they include infrastructure and public space for pedestrians and cyclists. Listening to citizens, of course, is key, because if governments start listening to citizens, and citizens are the majority of people who are walking and cycling, and you're shaping your decision making on the majority, automatically how we're spending budgets and planning and prioritizing transport solutions completely changes, because we're looking at 70 to 90% modal share for walking and cycling in many cities. So listening to citizens and giving them a space in the consultation process automatically starts changing how solutions look. And I think finally, research and data. I think it's easy to think with these kind of, presentations and interventions, there's one size fits all, but actually every neighborhood, every city, every country has its own needs. So it's really important that that data is being collected about what's needed, where are people moving, what are their individual requirements, so that policy and planning is shaped by data and is evidence driven. And I just wanted to finish really with this idea that we're in a transport disruption. So this is a slide, as you can see, showing back in the 1900s where there's one car and it's been ring fenced. Everyone else is in horses and carriages. And then if you just fast forward just 13 years, it's the complete opposite. Everyone, if you look closely enough, you'll be able to see the horse, but it's now completely flipped in just over 10 years. So, that's in our children's lifetime, that's in our lifetime. You're 30 and then you're 43. And in that time, we've switched from horses to cars. Now, I don't necessarily think that was a positive disruption, but I do think amidst this triple planetary crisis with road fatalities and air pollution and congestion and the lead up to COP26 and trying to deal with all of these climate emissions, that we may be at the cusp of a new transport, a new mobility disruption, but this time a positive one. You can get an electric car from a vending machine. You can have your parcels delivered by drone. COVID has shone a light on how important having an integrated, just transport system is. And we're seeing increased investment in public bike share schemes, cycling infrastructure, public space, pedestrian infrastructure. So I think we could be, I'm hopeful that we're on the cusp of the next transport disruption, but this time it's a positive one. And I hope if you're listening that you can come along and be part of that disruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Carly Gilbert Patrick, for the informative presentation. Again, if participants have any questions, please raise in the Q&A box below and will be addressed during the panel discussion. So, moving on, may I now cordially invite Yang Berbahagia Datin Town Planner Hajah Nuraida Saludin, the President of Malaysian Institute of Planners, to take her place as the moderator of the panel discussion session. Please welcome Yang Berbahagia Datin.
Thank you, Azira. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Datin.
Okay, thank you, Azira. Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Selamat petang and good afternoon to all participants and listeners to this WCSC 2021 edition. And welcome to the first session of the 2 days WCSC. I hope that everybody is comfortable wherever you are and have had your lunch, or if you have not, well, this is the beauty of having an online conference. You can multitask you have your lunch or coffee and listen to the speakers. If we were to do this physical, you'll be in a room where you don't have your coffee with you. So this is quite nice actually. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to invite to have with me at this very same platform, Ms. Carly Gilbert-Patrick from the United Nations Environment Programme, or in short UNEP, and also Mr. Esben Neander Christensen from Cycling Embassy of Denmark and GAL Architect. I had the pleasure of being at the GAL Architect's office way back in 2019. And also we had a speaker, met somebody from Cycling Embassy of Denmark who gave us a presentation at the office back then. It was a wonderful experience, and we managed to get to meet Mr. Gal himself. So that was a really a nice experience, and I think that's probably the last time I've travel abroad before the pandemic hits us. Before we begin, I wish to inform also to all participants that your question can be raised in the Q&A box in your Zoom, and I will pick up the question from there. We have about 40 minutes for the discussion session today. And there's a lot of questions in the chat box that I will straight away pick up. I've also have my some of my questions I would like to ask, but I think I'll put that aside first, and I'll bring up the questions from the participants today. There were maybe perhaps a question for Esben first. There are two questions from Miss Carmen Yong. She's asking Mr. Esben, what are the common challenges that you see in terms of putting people first instead of vehicles in Southeast Asia city, and how do you design around these challenges? And I'd like to also string these particular questions because somebody asked on how do you one of the challenges is weather. Do you have any experience in planning the same for countries with hot weather condition like Malaysia, and your experience in the Southeast Asia city? The second question for Esben too is from Mr. Ao Swee Lin. It is good to have bicycle lane, but in terms of safety of cyclists, it should also be taken into account. So basically, that's an opinion. That's not really a question. So, Esben.
Thank you so much. I mean, these are great questions, and I think this is especially the linking climate and weather with mobility choices. I think that's a big one, and I think that's one that in every single project, be it sort of more of an urban strategy nature or a development type project, of the example that I showed with a master plan, which is more a sort of comprehensive urban development, we look a lot into that, and I think that's a really important aspect. So one big thing has to do with making it actually fairly comfortable to spend time outside, and I think there are some good examples from the region of where that has been thought of in terms of promoting usage of public transit. I mean, the Singaporean public transit system comes to mind, where they've actually been very sort of adamant on putting awnings and coverings and tree shade and so on around station areas. But I think that needs to be expanded much more into a holistic model of how that kind of thing should happen at a city scale, right? So we think very naturally about air conditioning in buildings in hot places, but should we also think about planting trees and making sure that that's actually a priority for all the different beneficial things that trees they do? Should we think about canopies? Should we think about galleries? Are there things we can do in our typical street section that will actually make it much easier? Because I think, if you can reduce an ambient temperature by 5 degrees or something like that in the space, and you don't have the same reflection of surfaces and everything else. And this is a big difference. I mean, you will have in a place where you might be able to fry an egg on the asphalt, if you put in a tree or something like that, the temperature will actually go down to the ambient air temperature. So those are very different conditions. If we allow that, people will be much more likely to, for instance, embrace solutions like district parking, that you don't necessarily need to park right next to where you live or in the building, but you could actually begin to centralize a little bit more. I'm not saying that's the perfect model, but that's definitely one step of the way towards a more sustainable mobility solution. And that can also plug in with many different things, with EV charging stations and other mobility stations and so on. So that's just one step along the way. It's also transit, right? I mean, you take a train, you take a bus, but then if the last 2 kilometers that you have to move through the city, or the last kilometer or whatever it is, it's warm, it's hostile, you don't have a good sidewalk, the conditions for crossing roads and so on, getting out of the station. If all of that doesn't work, then all of a sudden the major investment that a city or a state or a region or a private developer might make in high-grade transit, it kind of falls through. You know, you need all these little supporting elements to actually make the larger part of the transit system work well. So I think that's a big thing, that we need to think of it in terms of experience again. We need to think, how can we come up with small solutions to actually solving all of these things that prevent people from biking, that prevent people from taking public transit, that prevents people from walking. In Malaysia, we hear a lot about safety, for instance, that the perception of safety when you're walking can be quite challenged in some places. And that also has to do with the conditions for walking, because if you have a sidewalk that's dominated by parking and you might have to walk on the outside of parked cars sometimes, you know, you're exposed to certain things. It might be a motor passing by or something like that. So again, thinking a little bit about the street section and making sure that we allocate the right amount of meters almost to each use of that section. So if there's so many people walking, we should actually promote that. We should make sure that they have good conditions for that. The same for biking and so on and so on. So it's a holistic approach again. There's not one specific answer to it. I think there's a lot of different factors, but again, look at it from a human experience point of view first. That gets us a long way. And then we had another question about, so it was heat, microclimate, climate, mobility choices, and the last thing was safety of biking, but that was more a statement, I think, right? Because of course I completely agree with that.
Yeah. Basically, sometimes when I give presentation and about bicycling or walking, and in Malaysia, people will ask me, "Yeah, it's hot here," and sometimes we show photos of people cycling in Denmark, and say people will say to me, they can cycle because the weather is nicer. It's nothing like Malaysia. But
well, you know, maybe right now, but you know, I assure you that in 3 months it won't be very nice to cycle. I mean, when you're in 3 degrees, December rain, wind in your face, like it feels like you're going uphill when you're going downhill because the wind is so strong here. You know, it's not necessarily nice. But I will give you that point that heat stress is of course an important condition, right? And I think a big element is thinking systemically about it in terms of, can we make it easy, and can we make it, maybe, you know, you will be exposed to a certain amount of heat, but if you can save a lot of time from parking, from sitting in traffic, then that might be worth it on its own. And I think that's the rationale that a lot of people are making. I was just a few weeks ago on my first post-pandemic trip, and it feels amazing to say it, but I was in Colombia, in Barranquilla in the north, which is Caribbean, 30-something degrees, very humid, a hilly city. And it's interesting because they're actually working with the same parameter, that they can make people save a lot of time by biking and walking. So again, if you can do it in 10 or 12 minutes, what will take you 45 minutes in a car, people are actually willing to expose themselves to a bit of heat. So it's about making the good choice also the easy choice for people, which is easier said than done, of course, but yeah.
Yeah. So I wanna. There's this question. I think let's ask this question to Kali, because Kali, you said that there are four areas or four fundamentals in giving priority for walking, pedestrian, and so shifting the mobility mode. One is you said champions and leaders and policies and budget, listening to the citizen and research and data. And budget has always been the biggest stumbling block in anywhere in the world. And like Malaysia, sometimes we have lots of policies, but the policies never get implemented. There's this question from an anonymous attendee. He didn't like his name there inside there, but the question is that policy can be made easily. However, application and enforcement may be difficult. In Malaysia, it is still perfectly fine for a 30-year internal combustion engine vehicle to be on the road. Is there any plan to impose a vehicle age limit? And what are the plans to build the EV infrastructure, green premium car, shifting it to the greener mode of vehicle, and also what is the direction moving forward from in shifting into the greener vehicle instead of fossil fuel driven vehicle. Kali.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a few, maybe a few different questions in one. So I'll see what I can pick out. I think you're right. That there's often this discussion that, we don't, a lot of pushback we get is we just don't have the budget to invest in walking and cycling infrastructure. And I always say yes, you do, because you're spending billions of dollars building roads and highways and flyovers. So quite often the question is not actually whether the budget is there or not, because when you look at national budget spend on transport all over the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, America, that transport normally takes up a huge percentage of transport spend, but it's what it's being spent on. So the debate is not really about whether the money's there or not. It's whether governments are prioritizing the spend on the people who need it the most, and often they're not. And even if you look somewhere like the UK with a huge transport budget and lots of money being spent on walking and cycling, when you look at the percentage being spent on walking and cycling, it's still tiny compared to that overall amount. The other thing is, the previous mayor of New York once said her biggest weapon for road fatalities was a pot of paint, because actually walking and cycling yes, there are lots of add-ons and it's great to have segregated infrastructure, but just getting the paint out and painting sidewalks is a first step. And it doesn't cost a lot. It definitely costs nowhere near as much as investing in bus rapid transit and light rail. The other thing about budget is that walking and cycling is completely directly linked to public transport. And if you're going to spend millions on a public transport system and buses, you need to just spend those few dollars extra to make sure that people can walk or cycle safely to get to the bus and when they get off the bus. Because what we're trying to do is make other forms of transport as convenient as the car. And the only way that happens is if the whole journey from A to Z is convenient and comfortable. So I think those were my thoughts on budget. I think with regards to the comment around Malaysia, and you can still drive a 30-year-old internal combustion engine, lots of countries, and I'd need to check if Malaysia is in there, but lots of countries are starting to introduce used vehicle regulations. And actually, there's a really interesting report that just came out looking at the global trade in used vehicles and how countries may have their own regulations about what vehicles can come in. But if countries don't have their own importation rules around regulation of vehicles, they can end up as dumping grounds for old vehicles. So it's really important that countries as well as investing in walking and cycling in public transport, they're also regulating the flow of used vehicles. And then with regards to EV infrastructure, the green premium to own and use an EV in Malaysia would still be high. It's why we are supporting over 50 countries with their electric mobility transition, but we're also supporting countries with walking and cycling and technology for public transport, because electric mobility on its own is not the solution. Yes, we need to clean up vehicles, but we need to keep working on public space and walking and cycling and public transport. Not everyone will be able to afford a vehicle, full stop, let alone an electric vehicle. But we do need to start that transition, so people buying cars and motorbikes and governments bringing in buses do have the option of electric. And part of the project that we're working with over 50 countries on electric mobility, all of those projects have a component on sustainability, particularly at batteries, because we need to, if we're not looking at renewable energy and battery recycling and second, third life of batteries, then you're kind of creating a problem as you're solving another problem.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah. Can I just jump in quickly?
Yeah.
To the last point.
Yes, but
just because I think it's a very, very, there's some this diagram of a car and an electric car, it takes up the same amount of space, and the thing is that if we imagine that just because cars in of themselves become relatively more sustainable, well, it'll still be a physical issue, right? We will still have to deal with where do they park. We will still, and that's a big driver in a lot of these projects that are more comprehensive in terms of also looking at urban development. So if you need to build massive parking structures, you negatively affect quality of life in an urban environment. You create places that are fairly hostile. You need to either dig them down and affect groundwater and ecosystems and so on. So, I mean, there are a lot of impacts to the car in itself that are just beyond the actual vehicle, right? Including the street space and the road dimensions and everything. So I just wanted to say I completely concur. I mean, it's such a loaded thing where one little decision actually has a number of effects in a range of different areas. So just adding to that, the physical dimension of storing cars and moving them and things like that, it's a big thing.
Yeah. Yeah, Kali, you mentioned that Nairobi spent 20% of the budget for walking infrastructure, and like cities like any other cities, for example, how much was it that the Jakarta spent for walking infrastructure? Is there any more data from any other cities? Because
there is no, and I'm always worried about saying, you should spend X percent because the situation in every city is completely different. And the Indonesia policy did not ring fence an amount in their policy, but what they've done since then is approve and finance different walking and cycling projects, this big one linked to their BRT. So it's not that, there has to be a specific amount, but one of the issues is lots of city governments do not have a line in their budgets. Like literally there's an Excel spreadsheet and there's lines on what you're spending, and there's recycling and there's waste management and there's transport, and obviously, and quite often it just says transport. So what happens is there's no ring fence for walking and cycling. So we do encourage governments to make sure they have a line in the Excel spreadsheet that says pedestrian needs and walking needs, because else it gets forgotten and overlooked. And also with these big donor projects where there's funding coming in from international banks, quite often therefore, road expansion and highways, and there's kind of this reliance that the government will top it up and do the walking and cycling part, and it quite often doesn't happen. Or there's some money in there, but as soon as the budget goes over, the walking and cycling gets left, and we're told it's going to happen next year, and it never happens. So yeah, the budget's a real critical issue.
Yeah. So I hope our people in the audience who are from the municipalities and or city councils in Malaysia, we could look at how we itemize the budget so that we could really be able to identify what's the percentage spent in terms of the total transportation budget. for walking and cycling, and so that incrementally we could over the years increase it to achieve a certain target. I know for once Kuala Lumpur have a target to expand its cycling network and also to expand the walking infrastructure for the city, as earlier mentioned in the keynotes by the keynote speaker, Kuala Lumpur Mayor. Moving on, Esben, there is a question on in terms of public spaces on the projects that you've narrated or give the example today. There seem like there are projects by the local government, or are they a project by private entities? It's just that the person who's asking this question would like to know if we reflect it in Malaysia, the fund for that kind of project comes from local authorities. Was there any example of funding that comes from a private entity in terms of improving public spaces in cities that you've worked on?
So of the examples that we gave, I would say one of them was a city funded with a city authority, a municipality as a client, and the two other ones were private in various forms. Well, one private and one which was a combination. So I would say the part of the office that I specifically represent, we have something like 70 to 80% private clients. So that could be investors, it could be development companies. And, of course, they approach us because they have a certain, very big alignment with some of the ideas that we have, and we work together on some of these things. And what that means is that very often, for instance, the Chilean example that I showed, we might be working with them within the red line of the actual site to define, what should the urban structure be like, what should the public spaces be like. But then they're also looking into, as part of that project, how can they reach out and connect to the surrounding areas? So that's beyond the red line. So it's actually them going in and partnering with the local municipality to figure out how can we make upgrades of public realm and streetscape in those areas so we improve the overall connectivity. So I think that there are quite a few examples of that way of working. It could also be, in many cases, if it's a district plan, for instance, that you will have businesses or private interests that are in a specific geography in a specific area represented that will also have an interest in creating a better and more inviting and just public realm and creating better connections and so on. So I would say it's from a company perspective, sort of all the projects that we do, it's probably about 50-50. But there are many examples of how private development groups or private companies of different kinds can either lead, drive, or chip in terms of resources to any sort of public space improvement project.
So because there are also in Malaysia, I think there are some projects that are private township, especially township projects that by private developers who one or two that have started with building the public spaces first instead of building the commercial or residential, because they realize now the public spaces is the crowd puller, and they've managed to use that the parks that they created to really as part of the promotional marketing strategy. And then there's great value now that people are wanting to go to this comprehensively planned township that provides a seamless experience of cycling and walking. And I would like, somebody is asking that I think Shahrum Abidin is saying that Esben, he had cycled to work for 8 years now in Malaysia. Wow, that's I've not known anybody who have cycled to work, and to do it for 8 years, that's amazing, in Malaysia. And he said that he also know many people who wants to do it and would love to cycle to work like him. I kind of disheartened with by the fact that we don't have enough infrastructure for it, for people to cycle safely to work. And I know in Malaysia, when you cycle in the hot temperature weather, you get sweaty, and then you have to change your clothes, or you have to go shower. Yeah. How do you propose that, for us in Malaysia, for example, that we could resolve this? Instead of at the moment, the cycling, a lot of cycling is done more for leisure in Malaysia as recreational activity. So over the weekend, you see a lot of people cycling. But how do we move from cycling as a recreational mode into using bicycle or cycling to work? How do we do that? How do we transition to that?
So I think this, what's interesting to see is when you visit a lot of and see a lot of different examples in a lot of different places who are sort of at different stages of development, you can kind of see some patterns that are slightly similar. I mean, you will have, from going to a situation where there's almost no cycling, then all of a sudden you'll get like these little bubbles where you might have places where you can do recreational cycling. As you said, you might have more comprehensively planned areas that might actually have good conditions locally, but they're not part of a wider network. So it's hard to get, from where you live to where you work to where you study, because you don't really have those things. And as soon as you get out of the area, it's a completely different situation because the street sections and the network is different. You might have places where in more inner city environments, they will have bike hire rental schemes of different kinds. A lot of cities have actually been very successful in using that as almost like, if I use a term that's a little bit wrong maybe for this, but something like a gateway drug, like Ghg in Mexico City, which for a very long time, I don't remember if that's still the case, they were the biggest public bike share system in the world. And what has happened is that people will have their Ghg card and they will use that system, and then it's a stepping stone on the way to actually buying your own bike and beginning to bike yourself, right? And it's also a way to expose more people to something, so that there's bigger demand and there's a bigger political pressure to actually implement bike lanes. And that someone else asked a question in the chat about COVID, which has been quite interesting, because in that case, quite a few corridors have been established throughout COVID as a response to create better sort of healthy mobility options for people. And they're actually looking into making those more permanent now. So it's this whole thing where you can always use a more tactical project in the interest of a bigger sort of more strategic goal. And once you're at a stage where you might have bubbles and you might have certain areas that have good conditions, then you need to start looking into how do you connect those areas? How do you create good connections? How do you actually create a viable network? Once you have the network, you might be able to go from point A to point B, but it might be a bit slow because you're, congestion, or there's a lot of intersections and so on. So could we look into, for instance, aligning with green spaces or parks to create sort of a system of supercycle highways, which is something that they've been doing in Copenhagen at the moment, where they've taken existing green corridors that are typically next to bigger highways and so on, that actually have good conditions in terms of microclimate, you're in nature, there are trees and so on, and sort of began to put in cycle routes that go further out into the suburbs. So all of a sudden, it's not just a 5K or 3K ride, it could also be a 20K or 25K ride. And people are actually using this. So, and then the last thing, I think, again, temperature, climate, just like I showed an example of a place to put your foot when you're at an intersection, or just the fact that in the city of Copenhagen, the bike lanes are the ones that are cleared of snow first before they clear the car lanes when it snows. We also need to think about vegetation and microclimate. I think that's one of the key issues. If we can align green spaces and spaces for mobility for pedestrians and for walking and biking, and we can create a positive microclimate experience, we're quite far along the way. But that might mean that we need to think a little bit differently about how it's done in a place like Malaysia compared to how it's done in a place that has, a different temperature range. So just like with everything else, I think there's a specific contextual answer to it that we need to look into. But there's a series of things that could be done from the small scale and building up till you get to the network, until you figure out what are the next levels that we need to begin expanding on and developing after we have a sort of coherent network.
Ali, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to add.
Yeah.
So it's such an interesting question, and we get this question a lot, you know, like it's too hot here, or it's too cold here, or it's too hilly here. And actually some of the countries with the highest cycling rates have very hot weather, or very cold weather, or very hilly. And fundamentally we're all the same type of human. And I think the solution is just build it and they will come. And I think that there needs to be this kind of consensus, whoever's making the decisions about transport in a particular city. If the hardest part is getting to the agreement or the consensus that we are going to prioritize active modes of transport, because you have to kind of make that strategic decision first and the rest will follow. And I think, you know, in Nairobi where I live, again, it's the same questions. It's so hot, it's so hilly, it's not safe. And we built just like a 3-kilometer pilot on a hilly road close to the UN. And within a day, everyone started cycling and walking on that infrastructure, because all of a sudden it was comfortable, it was nice, people could stop and talk without the worry that a car was going to run them over. The cars were not parking on the sidewalk. So I think sometimes we complicate it, but actually it's making that decision that we're going to prioritize the majority, which is people who walk and cycle, and we're going to make it safe and good, and we're going to spend a bit of money, and nowhere near as much money we spend as building roads, but we're going to build a network of infrastructure linked to public transport for our pedestrians and cyclists, and people will start using it when it's convenient. I used to cycle in the ice when I lived in Cambridge in the UK, because it was most convenient. If I took my car, the parking charge at the car park at the train station was going to cost me like £50 a day, whereas I could cycle and park my bike for free. So it didn't matter that it was snowing. I just wore a hat and gloves. You just kind of, as long as the infrastructure is safe and convenient and comfortable and free, people will use it.
But in other cities, people are able to bring their bike on the public transport, right? And here in Malaysia, we are still not able to do it 100%. There are times that we are doing it, it's scheduled on a schedule. So what's the huge difference with public transport? Being able to carry your bike in a train, would it really help to incentivize people to also then continue their journey with cycling?
Yeah, I'll come in first. So I think it goes back to taking the decision that we're prioritizing pedestrians and cyclists, and then yes, providing them a carriage and a space to put their bikes will really help people who want to cycle on the other end, and having parking at the train stations. I mean, there are some cities in Latin America where the way people get to the buses is only by cycling. So there are no smaller buses, everyone just cycles, and there are showers, there are lockers, there's parking spaces for the bikes. So the cities have designed their transport system in a way that cycling is the way that gets everyone to the buses to then do the largest part of the journey, and then on the other end. So yeah, I think parking and providing spaces on trains is always a good idea. It needs to be planned, and there needs to be a bit of strategy and thinking. You can't all of a sudden not have space for the people because it's all the bikes, but there's definitely ways to do it. I think Espen's going to jump in now.
It's a strategy of combining strategy of parking as well, and pricing of charges for parking as well. Because in Malaysia, it's still cheap to park and to bring your car into the city, and it's still cheap to park in the city. Should there be a reduction in parking provision at the commercial area, for example, and increase the parking provision at the station? And what about the charges? should they? What's the strategy or the policy that we should go into as a counter or to get people to move to cycling? Any one of you?
Just wanted to add to the example before that there's a really interesting reference from Mexico City about an existing very large public transit system, the metro, which has something like 15 lines, and I think it's the fourth busiest metro in the world, fourth or fifth busiest metro in the world, second in the Americas after New York. And they put in a few years ago, they started a massive scheme of adding bicycle parking to metro stations to an existing system where you cannot carry your bike on the train. But the bicycle parking scheme has been extremely successful. So it's a retrofit of an existing system, much like would be the case in a lot of other places in the world. And that's an interesting one to look into. The question, I think that's a really, it's a tricky one, right? Because, I mean, you can either go the way of sort of radical change, or you can say that realistically we need to, and also knowing that there's something that's happening with the EVs and so on, we need to be gradual. But my point before was there's a really big physical and human scale consequence of all the choices that we're doing with parking. So it's not just about transit numbers and traffic and so on, but I think it has a lot of ramifications for our physical environment. So, whenever we can think smarter about parking and put limits on parking one way or the other, I think that's something we need to look into. And then the question is also always, does it have to be done gradually? Or is it something where you really do need to think, this is something that we need to revolutionize and do it sooner rather than later? But in some places, just going to a district parking model where you have a building structure that isn't, with 4 or 5 sublevels underground that can never be used for anything else, and you actually maybe put your parking in one building instead of distributing it, that has a lower impact, and that can over time also be converted into a different use. But that again requires that people that might have to walk a kilometer from that parking place to where they live or where they work, right? So, again, nice microclimate, safety, and so on, that becomes a thing again. And that last 1 kilometer and that experience, it's key. But I don't know enough about the policy aspect to say if one is better than the other. I can just, see that those are the 2 parameters that you can have on the table, depending on what the political landscape looks like.
Ali, any view on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, there's no one answer, and the team in Malaysia, and I think, something I definitely want to offer is if we've got government departments here that are thinking about how to prioritize walking and cycling, I think, we'd be very happy to support that initial conversation. I think the tricky thing with active mobility is there are quite often lots of different government departments who have a responsibility. So you sometimes have the city team, then you have the highways who are responsible for the big roads, but they go through cities, and then you have the housing and the planning. There are sometimes teams managing parking. Sometimes parking's already been outsourced to the private sector. So I think the first step is bringing together all of those different players and having a conversation about the challenges and what some of the solutions might be, and then coming up with some sort of vision on what Malaysia would like these cities to look like, and then working through the practicalities from there. So it's really hard to just take an example that's worked somewhere else and try and copy and paste it all together. You kind of have to start from scratch with the specific needs, city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood. But people are doing it, and it's happening, and there are really good examples in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa that can be learned from. But there has to be that willingness to have the conversation first. And just to keep on the Nairobi example, in many ways it's a success story, but in other ways it's still challenging implementing that policy. So the policy is owned by the Nairobi city, but many of the roads that are affected in Nairobi are not managed by Nairobi city. They're managed by other national agencies. So when we see new infrastructure being built, whenever it's being built by Nairobi city, it always includes walking and cycling infrastructure. But if it's a highway going through the city, it does not always. because the other authorities have not taken ownership or agreed to sign up to the policy. They were involved in the consultation. So even in good examples like Nairobi, we're still dealing with problems all the time in implementing the policy.
Some things sounds very familiar too. Esben, you in one of your slides you used the term soft mobility. Would you care to elaborate that, because it says that it can unlock new users of land and building, and this would also be related to the question by Miss Anna Kashri on what we put. Her question was what we put along the route of this active mobility is important. It helps to invite people and encourage people to use. So how do land economy and building typology play a role in changing the mobility landscape within a city?
Yeah, well, soft mobility, that's an interesting, I think that might be a little bit of an internal title or something. We like the word soft when we describe things, as opposed to sometimes, Carly, you were talking about the different silos and this sort of separation into functions, where it's often a very hard way of looking at cities. So the highway is one thing, and all of these other functions are different aspects. And I think one of the things that we need to embrace in a way is that a lot of things actually happen between those silos. So not just in terms of collaboration, but also in terms of there are little bits and pieces of all the things that make up our urban systems that aren't necessarily represented, or they might be so much crossing the different boundaries of silos that it's actually hard to embrace it in any given project. We've done, for instance, some work on access to food and the combination with mobility systems lately. And it's sort of, who do you talk to? Is it health? Is it mobility? Is it planning? What department in the city do you talk to? And I mean, in that case, it only works when you start bringing people together. So that's why we like the word soft. I mean, it specifically refers to, I guess, walking and cycling and public transit and all these different non-private vehicle-based ways of moving around a city. And the second question, sorry, would you mind repeating it?
The activities and the land use and the use of buildings and the typology of building, how does that influence the changing mobility within a city?
I think it goes both ways. So if you have building typologies that do address the street, that have human scale, where you feel comfortable, you feel you're in an attractive environment when you walk next to the facade, then people are much more likely to actually walk, and they're much more likely to bike as well. And the thing is, the bigger the scale of things go, you begin getting up to sort of this highway, motorway, freeway scale, and all the buildings will have big motor lobbies and parking entrances and so on. The environment becomes all about cars, and it becomes sort of an environment that's made for moving at 100 kilometers an hour or 50 kilometers an hour, and not so much for 5 kilometers an hour or 15. And I think that makes a big difference. So, it's once you start going down one road in terms of mobility choices, you're also locking that in by changing your typology and scale of building and so on. And we're seeing in a lot of projects how it's actually really hard to go the other way. Once you've made that choice to go up to this mega scale, how do you then begin breaking things up a little bit more? I mean, maybe you're adding the same amount of square meters, but you're just doing it in a very different way and delivering the product in a different way. And it's a different type of product, because it's much more about seamless connections and being able to get out easily in a green space or a park, or the street is actually nice enough for you to spend time there. Whereas the other model of really big development, it almost sometimes becomes about, how do I access the parking garage the easiest and get up into my apartment somewhere? And there are very different models of looking at things. So our challenge right now is actually looking into how do we maybe go back to a model that has more productive outcomes for our societies and our cities.
Okay, we've don't have much time actually. I've been normally if it's a physical conference, somebody would be flagging up the placard to say that 5 minutes, 3 minutes. I've been informed that we don't have much time, but I have a few more questions. I wanted to ask Kali, you said 2,000 people lost their life on road as a statistic, right? And I wanted to ask you what's your view on, because I think the last 2 days, the Malaysian government made an announcement, and then they retracted it, that they would prohibit driving license to people 70 years and above. Was there any data or statistic that demonstrate the accident tendency or accident prone into a group of people, the elderly, the younger, the teenagers, the children? Was there any statistic that, it's just there's no evidence on it?
Yeah, so there's a few different levels of data collection. So the big global data set that we use is the World Health Organization Global Road Safety Report, which they produce. And that's really our kind of go-to with data. That report does not include a breakdown of the it includes the group, so the most vulnerable with motorbikes, pedestrians and cyclists make up this kind of vulnerable group, which tend to be the most impacted by road fatalities in every region, actually. That report doesn't break down who causes those fatalities and whether they were, what age they were, or what gender they were, but then there is the data that's collected by countries and the data that's collected by cities. Now, some cities and countries do collect that level of data, but many do not. So I mean, there are guidance and there are best practice with regards to how licenses are sought and the training, and quite often it's competency based, which is, can you see here, can you hear this, can you do this, rather than age based. But it's a country by country kind of decision. Yeah.
Before we end the session, I wanted to ask, because somebody made a comment on 500-meter walking distance, 500-meter cities, the concept of the new the concept of urbanism. And now we are reading a lot of cities are going into 10-minute cities, 15-minute cities, 20-minute cities. What's your view on how this planning concept will help to reduce carbon emission and change mobility mode into the climate friendly mode of traveling? Kali? Sorry,
I didn't. I completely froze. Sorry, could you repeat that for me?
Yeah, I wanted to ask that, earlier, even when the early planning, we were talking about 500 meters city planning or neighborhood planning. But now a lot of concepts are coming in. A lot of cities are talking about 15-minute cities, 20-minute cities, 10-minute cities, right? And how are this new or this notion helps in terms of reducing carbon emission, and also move people from motorized mode of traveling into the mobility, active mobility mode of traveling?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, I love the concept of the 15-minute neighborhood and the 15-minute city. And I mean, it goes back to that very basic framework of avoid, shift, improve. Of course, if people can get out the front door, they can go to the local market seller to get some fruit, walk 5 minutes to the dentist or the doctor, then it avoids the need to travel. But we still, even within this concept of a 15-minute city, we still need to make it comfortable for people to walk 15 minutes, right? So if your journey is 5 minutes to the mall, but there's nowhere to cross the road, it's high speed, there's a highway, there's no crossing points, then you're still going to jump in your car, even if you live in a 15-minute city. So I think yes, as a concept and a package and a way of thinking, it's a really great idea, but it still comes down to really understanding the needs of the people living in that neighborhood, living in that city, and designing it in a way that makes it safe to move around and giving everyone options and choices.
Esben?
And just to add to that, I think that, you know, there's this term called food desert, which I guess originated in the US and inner cities in the US, which is very interesting because basically it's all about how we got to this point where we're at now. So we have places that have been so, you know, neglected in a way that they're completely outside the normal system of how do we supply food to our cities, that they've essentially become places where you can buy a soda or a bag of chips or maybe something in a can if you're really lucky, but there's actually no access to fresh food. And this is something that we're working with at the moment in a couple of different places. In Bogota is one. And what's happening is, you know, again, you need to cover the basics, right? The mobility aspects, being able to move around, being able to cross the street, and at all different levels of society, because 15-minute city, 20-minute city, I've even seen Stockholm, they put a 1-minute city. You know, that's really nice, but what happens often is that it becomes something that happens in central core areas that are already fairly well served with all these different amenities and access to food and access to employment and so on, whereas in more peripheral areas that are more challenged, they kind of get swept a little bit under the rug. So it needs to be addressed at a regional level for especially these really large cities that are already here and will be more and more present in the future. I mean, looking at the numbers that we both showed in our slides. So there's a social fairness issue layer that's quite important to address, I think, on top of this 15-20-minute city.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting because as a lot more cities are implementing the concept or the new branding. I think that we have time for one last question. I think there's last question that came in from Miss Julie Chop. She's asking how relevant would policy initiative impose no fencing along the boundaries of private lot development project address permeability for walking and cycling, because in Malaysia, we still have a lot of development that fence up, and even gated community, gated and guarded community. How is that affect permeability for walking and cycling? I know perhaps maybe in the European cities, you don't have a lot of fence up development, but we still have it in Malaysia. It's a trend that everybody is really going for.
So we're working quite a bit with that question, and it's a very interesting one because there's, you know, you get market expectations, you get some cultural expectations, you get perception of safety. A lot of things are actually linked and sort of combined into a question about why is it that we come up with this typology of gating and closing off. And I think one of the interesting ways of working with this is actually to look into, are there ways we can provide the same experiences, but in a different and much more permeable format? We've had quite some successful experiences of, for instance, looking at that in Latin America, where if you take this is what I showed from Santiago, and I didn't dwell much on it because I just wanted to go through some examples and focus on mobility. But in terms of this whole thing of having a private space or a space that isn't accessible by everyone else, this model of having courtyards and sort of little closed off things where the building typology itself creates a space that you share with your neighbors, but it's not necessarily for everyone. That mimics a lot of the attractiveness of the gated community because you have a mini gated community. But then on the other side of your apartment, you have the street side, which is the street. So coincidentally, that's how a lot of people here in this city and in a lot of Northern European cities, they live because that's how the traditional morphology of the city has evolved. And you see the same patterns in many places, Southeast Asia, Latin America, typically in smaller units with a courtyard or a light well or something like that. But if you scale it up a little bit, you get a lot of the same qualities, but in a format that's much more permeable. So I think working with typology, working with the product types, and maybe trying to figure out how is it that we can meet some of the same needs and some of the same perceptions about safety and actually address those, but in a way where we still provide permeability. And again, maybe that's not something that you can do overnight. Maybe you need some interim solutions and some steps along the way, but there's definitely a way to explore different themes around typology. To us, that's a big part of the answer.
Thank you so much. Ali, do you want to add to that?
No, not really. I think, I'm just supportive of what Esben has said. It's a tricky situation and it's a balancing act, but I think he's covered everything. Thanks.
Yeah. So we've come to the end of our session today. It's been very engaging for me and I'm so honored to be moderating this session today. There's a lot to learn from both speakers, and I think there's questions that's coming in from the participants are great. And I think I wish we have a longer time, but I think we have to part ways very soon. Before we end the session, maybe perhaps I could ask Esben and Kali to just say last word before we end the session, so that we in Malaysia especially would be very motivated to take the and like Kali said, just build it, it will come. And and also to just like Nike said, just go and do it, right? So Kali.
Thanks. I think what I'd like to end on is where you've come across really great examples of public space and walking and cycling. It's not a government that made that happen. There's normally one or two individuals behind the scenes doing the talking to different departments, putting their neck out and saying, actually, guys, we need to do things differently. And I think, there have been almost 500 people on this conference, and hopefully there are a few people in this listening who are those people or who could be those people. So, don't leave and just think someone else is going to sort it out, because it kind of has to be you. And I put my email in, and I'm definitely ready to support any government departments who want it to be them, who are ready to kind of be that champion, and we're always happy to support. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the offer. So the participants from local government, take the Ms. Kali's email and you can directly connect with her. Esben?
No, I think that was a brilliant way to sum up the session. I think there's something about what are our expectations and what are some of our perceptions, and then sometimes also, trying to challenge them a little bit, both on the public sector side, but also very much in terms of private development, where, I think people are actually ready to try new things in terms of how they live. I think we're at a moment where we're seeing a lot of places in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa in particular, where there is a realization that the way we live and have lived up until now, that model is more and more breaking. It's not sustainable to commute 1, 2, 3 hours each way to get to your place of work. And it's just not quality of life. And how can we actually come up with a model that gives people some more time back at all different levels of society? And I think that requires a shift in mindset, both in public sector, real estate development, very much also within government and so on. All the things that we've discussed now with budgets and transparency and clarity around what actually goes to the elements that we've put on the table today. So I think, changing mindsets a little bit and being open, I think that's a very important aspect. We're of course working with a couple of things in Malaysia at the moment, and we're very happy to talk to anyone who wants to have a discussion about these things. And just waiting for the MCO to be completely over so we can come visit again, because that's been very strange working in Malaysia for the last year and not having been able to go to the places that we worked on. So looking very much forward.
Yeah, I think somebody said putting life at the center of attention. that's core to it, and is so true now, and is that this notion is so very true now, that the fact that we are in this pandemic situation, we've got to look at the human scale and inviting and putting steps and effort to invite life into the city. And with that, I would like to thank both Kali and Esben for such a wonderful session today. And thank you very much on behalf of the WCSC 2021 organizers. And also to the participants, thank you so much for spending your time with us today at WCSC. And don't forget, we have one more day tomorrow. So we hope to see you tomorrow. And with a few more, I think 2 more sessions with wonderful, wonderful speakers. So with that, thank you very much. And over to you, Ms. Azira.
Thank you, Yang Berbahagia Datin. And thank you everyone for gracing our ceremony today with your presence. We truly appreciate it. Tomorrow's session will start at 9 a.m. using the same link. So all participants are advised to log in 10 minutes early. Please do join us tomorrow with more interesting keynote and paper presentation under the sub-theme of Urban Greenery and Low Carbon Building. That's all for today, and see you tomorrow for the second day of our 12th World-Class Sustainable Cities International Conference. Take care, stay safe. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, everyone.